I remember my first year at Lincoln High like it was yesterday. The nervous excitement, the way my hands shook when I stood in front of my first class. I wanted so badly to be a good teacher, the kind who made kids feel seen, not just heard. That's why what happened with Jamal and Ms. Wilkins stuck with me. It wasn't just a bad moment. It was the kind of moment that changes how you see people. The incident Jamal Carter was one of those kids who slipped under the radar. Not loud, not disruptive, but not the kind to raise his hand either. He showed up, did his work, most of the time, and kept to himself. I always got the sense there was more going on with him, like he was holding his breath, waiting for high school to be over. Ms. Wilkins had been teaching English at Lincoln for 15 years. She was one of those teachers who prided herself on being old school. No coddling, no excuses. At first, I admired her. She commanded respect. But then I started noticing the way her strictness wasn't the same for everyone. The day it happened, Jamal walked in late. Again. His hoodie was damp from rain, and he looked exhausted. Ms. Wilkins didn't even let him sit down. Late again? Jamal, she said, voice sharp. Let me guess, your alarm didn't go off? A few kids chuckled. Jamal muttered an apology and tried to slide into his seat, but she stopped him. No. Stand right there. She crossed her arms. Since you clearly don't take this class seriously, maybe you'd like to explain to everyone why your homework also isn't done. Jamal's jaw tightened. I had to work late. I'll turn it in tomorrow. Work? She scoffed. At a gas station, right? Is that really more important than your education? The way she said it, like his job was something shameful, made my skin prickle. Then she dropped the bomb. You know, Jamal, some kids have real responsibilities at home and still manage to get their work done. But I guess some people just don't have the same standards. The room went dead silent. Jamal's face shut down completely. No anger, no embarrassment, just empty. Like he'd heard this before. I should have said something, but I didn't. I just sat there, gripping my desk, heart pounding. The aftermath, Jamal never came back to her class. He transferred out the next week. I found out later that he'd been working nights because his mom was sick. He was helping pay rent, but Ms. Wilkins never asked. She just assumed. A year later. The next fall, I walked into the teacher's lounge and nearly dropped my coffee. Ms. Wilkins was sitting at the table, dressed in plain clothes instead of her usual blazer. She was talking to Principal Harris, her voice low and urgent. I really need this position, she was saying, just until something permanent opens up. That's when Jamal walked in. Except he wasn't a student anymore. He was wearing a staff badge, carrying a stack of papers. Jamal? Working here? Then it hit me. He'd graduated last spring and was now a teacher's aide while studying at the community college. Ms. Wilkins froze when she saw him. Her mouth opened, then closed. Jamal didn't even flinch. He just nodded at her, polite but cold, and said, "Morning." Then he turned to me with a small smile. "Hey, Mr. Daniels. Ready for the meeting?" I followed him out, my head spinning. The conversation. Later that day, I was grabbing my things from the faculty lounge when I spotted them near the senior lockers. Ms. Wilkins standing too close, her posture rigid with the kind of forced casualness people use when they're desperate. Jamal had his back to the lockers, his staff ID dangling from the lanyard around his neck, catching the fluorescent light. "Jamal," she started, then corrected herself with a tight smile. "Mr. Carter. I just wanted to say..." Her voice faltered, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked uncertain. "I hope there's no hard feelings." The hallway. Noise seemed to fade. Jamal studied her, his expression unreadable. I could see the calculations running behind his eyes. All the times she'd made him feel small. All the times she'd assumed the worst of him. When he finally spoke, His voice was steady, quiet, the kind of calm that comes from absolute certainty. "No hard feelings, Ms. Wilkins." He tilted his head just slightly, like he was considering her from a new angle. "But you should know, I do remember." A beat of silence. Somewhere down the hall, a locker slammed. "And now," he continued, tapping his ID badge lightly with one finger, "I'm the one signing off on substitute requests." Her face went pale. Not the dramatic, gasping kind of shock, but the slow drain of color that happens when someone realizes the ground has shifted beneath them. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. For a woman who'd always had a cutting remark ready, she had no words. Jamal didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He just nodded once, a dismissal, and turned to walk away, his footsteps echoing down the tiled hallway. Ms. Wilkins stood frozen for a long moment, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. Then she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and walked in the opposite direction. But not before I saw her swallow hard, like she was forcing down something bitter. The whole exchange couldn't have lasted more than a minute. But in that minute, something fundamental had changed. The power dynamic had flipped, and both of them knew it. She didn't get the job. I was in Principal Harris's office when the decision was made. Jamal hadn't said a word against her. He didn't have to. The committee just took one look at her recent evaluations, at the complaints buried in her file, and that was that. When they told her, her face did this awful little twitch, like she'd been slapped but was too proud to react. She gathered her things with stiff, precise movements, her lips pressed into a thin line. For a woman who'd spent years making students feel small, she looked strangely fragile, holding that cardboard box of desk trinkets. A week later, word got around that she'd taken a job at Jefferson High, the struggling school across town, with leaky ceilings and a revolving door of staff. Rumor was they'd hired her as a last-minute replacement for a teacher who'd quit mid-year. The math teacher who lived in her apartment building said she came home every day looking drained. Her shoulders slumped. Apparently, Jefferson didn't tolerate her old-school discipline the way Lincoln had. Kids talked back. Parents complained. The vice principal had already written her up twice. Meanwhile, Jamal thrived. He started an after-school program for kids who needed extra help, the ones who slipped through the cracks, just like he had. I'd walk by his classroom and see him leaning over a desk, patient as anything, explaining algebra to some wide-eyed freshman. "Nah, you're not dumb," he'd say, grinning. "This stuff's just sneaky. Let's trick it into making sense." Sometimes, when I passed him in the hall, he'd nod at me with this quiet understanding in his eyes, like we both knew something sacred about second chances. And every time, without fail, I'd think about Ms. Wilkins. How she used to stride through these same hallways like she owned them, her heels clicking like a warning. How she'd roll her eyes at the slackers and the lost causes. All those years she spent looking down at kids like Jamal from the lofty height of her tenure. Funny how life works. Some people spend their whole lives looking down on others, until one day they're the ones looking up.